Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So, last episode we discussed theories of political change. I hope at least, fair in my criticism of the online left for pursuing outside strategies without a full pathway to victory. And I tied in my perspective on how to combine those strategies with one of my own that I'd humbly like to think gets a little closer to how we get to substantive change. I also hope my criticism of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the squad was fair, that they owe us an explanation of their pathway to victory for the policies that they ran on. This leads me to a discussion of some of those policies the political left is still gunning for. So I'd like to spend this episode talking about two of those policies and how they tie into a broader conversation about why those policies are stalling and how we can jumpstart them. So the two policies I'd like to discuss are Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. Basically, if you've looked at any profile, any website for a congressional candidate that runs with a leftist or progressive platform, you'll likely see Medicare for All and Green New Deal nearer at the top of the list. And that's not a mistake, right? These are policies that are generally targeted at rooting out inequality and basically at leveling the playing field. And that's largely what the political left in this country, broadly speaking, wants to do. And yet, we have several folks that were elected on that platform in the House of Representatives, and yet we're not much closer than we were when many of them were elected in 2018 to getting those plans passed. So it begs the question of why. And in my view, this comes down to a branding question, and I'll come back to that shortly. But at this stage, I'm recording this when both the Green New Deal and Medicare for All have been recently reintroduced in the House of Representatives. Medicare for All was reintroduced with almost no fanfare, and the Green New Deal likewise had little fanfare associated with its reintroduction, and also appears to have been basically not considered in the crafting of the infrastructure legislation that is being discussed. And I guess the other major sort of piece of news is that there are new attempts being made by congresspeople to lower the Medicare age to as low as 50 or 55. Which is the closest we've seen to kind of new life around getting us on the trajectory towards Medicare for All. And this is happening at the same time that while our country is continuing to vaccinate at a decent clip, we are seeing a huge spike in cases the world over that is centered in India. At the same time that pharmaceutical companies are engaged in a rhetorical battle over the intellectual property around the vaccines, which countries are discussing whether or not there should be a waiver for the intellectual property, for the patents, in order to allow countries to start developing and producing the vaccine for their populations to get us closer to herd immunity worldwide, ideally. And so obviously this is a healthcare crisis that has always been, a global one, and that we've generally tackled more as a national one, and are now seeing the repercussions of that lack of foresight and attempting to course correct. And obviously a lot has been made, or I'd say a decent amount has been made, of the fact that Biden has the power to, in an emergency fashion, using emergency powers, give Medicare for All to the population by virtue of the pandemic that's ongoing, and has decided not to for goodness knows what reason. And likewise, we have a pending climate crisis. Perhaps it's more accurate to say an currently exploding, ongoing climate crisis. And at least our country is targeting numbers that are not up to the scope of the problem. So we have these two big problems that leftists, progressives have introduced solutions to, and yet they're going nowhere. So why aren't they going anywhere? Let's just say there are strong, powerful, wealthy corporate interests that are actively fighting against the notion that we should have a Green New Deal, or we should have Medicare for all, or even we should have, I believe the hashtag going around right now is people's vaccine. Just a people's vaccine where we waive the intellectual property rights and let everyone have access to the ingredients and methods used to produce a vaccine to cover everybody, and get us to a point where we can hopefully return to some kind of new normal that might approximate where things were before the pandemic. And so here we are, right? The left has proposed a number of plans that address these monumental crises, and they are stalling for whatever reason. And as I alluded to earlier, I think a major problem here is branding. Medicare for All, I would argue, is probably the best branded leftist program, because as long as you know what Medicare is, it's a relatively easy argument to make that one of the most beloved public programs that, at least in the public record, does a decent job of taking care of the most vulnerable among us, the elderly. And obviously, the viability of the plan is at least backed by public support. I believe the most recent number I saw in terms of popularity of the Medicare for All program idea was 69%, which, you'd be hard pressed to find, let's say, 10 ideas that 69% of Americans support doing. You'd be hard pressed to find better support for a public program that people are actively discussing implementing. That doesn't exist already. By contrast, the Green New Deal was very quickly lambasted by the right. Not that Medicare for All wasn't, but the Green New Deal was lambasted in part because they had already had their arguments ready on the right, which were basically about how climate change isn't real, isn't really happening, and it being a Trojan horse for socialism, I believe, was one of the attacks leveraged against the Green New Deal, because it's moving towards universal housing and jobs guarantees and these kinds of things that, like I say, the right has kind of a pre-packaged set of talking points for. And so we have on one hand, Medicare for All program that is, I'd say, very well branded, but not getting passed. And Green New Deal, I would argue, was less well branded, and I'll get to that in a moment here. In terms of, like I say, it was easier to attack. And I would say that generally speaking, these are two kind of traps that leftist policies tend to fall into. Is, it's a great idea that sounds good on paper, but there are, interests stacked up against it. Or, the terminology used to describe it, in the case of the Green New Deal, is less accessible, and again, that leaves it open to a varied number of attacks, shall we say. So, with that in mind, I guess what I'd say is my first decent idea of the day, of the episode, if you will, would be that we have to at least consider rebranding the Green New Deal. Obviously, it's steeped in history, based off the New Deal instituted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which led to, the biggest expansion of public programs in recent political memory, at least. But I think it gets to, a bigger point about the way that it hits the crux of kind of, I guess, where the Democratic Party sits, in the sense that it's, a center to center right party, as I've attempted to demonstrate in previous episodes, but with, several left leaning members. I think it's difficult to argue that they're not left leaning. There aren't left leaning members in Congress, although I'm sure some would try to make that argument. And by the way, the last episode, as I alluded to again, I levied some criticism against the more left-leaning, or at least left-presenting, maybe might be a better way to put it, that might ruffle fewer feathers, maybe. So I guess what I'm getting at in terms of this crux of the relationship between the leftist members of the Democratic Party and the sort of Democratic establishment, which is what runs the party, which, like I say, is a center to center right, I guess, standing, if you will. So the problem that I'm getting at is that the idea is big and bold, like leftists tend to be, progressives tend to be in terms of policy, but the branding is often very sort of consultant or focus group tested, to try and come up with the best way we think will appeal to the broadest number of people. It tends to lead to an overthinking, in my view, of, like I say, branding. So what I would propose in the case of the Green New Deal is rebranding into something much more straightforward. My proposal for your consideration is to rebrand it as the Clean Air Green Jobs Plan. A lot of the disinformation, misinformation, both and, around climate change is basically targeting the inaccessibility of the science, right? That, it's hard to convince people of a geologic time-based change in the way our climate is functioning, that in practice only shows up in tenths of a degree of relative temperature over time. So it's hard for people to get their head around that, or to really be able to see that, in their daily lives. I'd argue that it's getting less easy to ignore with more powerful storms, whether they're hurricanes, more frequent storms, like hurricanes, or cold snaps like what happened in Texas, which, again, because of the disinformation, it's easy to kind of spin that as, oh, well, you used to call this global warming, right? Not climate change. Why is it getting colder in Texas? That's it's a hard thing to fight against. So what I'm suggesting is to simplify the messaging to pollution, right? That fossil fuels are belching smoke into the air, and everyone wants clean air for their kids, right, and for their future generation. And so simplifying it, and by the way, you could broaden the definition and say clean air, clean water, clean earth, but just to sort of simplify the idea and make it more accessible. And then by augmenting that by saying green jobs, okay, well, it's a lot of people will balk at just the use of the word green, but if you make the case that what we're doing is creating new industries, right? That I think is one of the strongest arguments for moving forward with new energy sources, or increasing access to these more novel energy sources like wind and solar. And hydroelectric is actually a very old technology, but one that has been increasingly modernized. By making the case that what we're doing is growing and spawning new industries. And by the way, there are many. I'm sure there are tens of different kinds of energy sources that we haven't even come up with yet by virtue of, lack of federal funding and political will to get that federal funding. And so making the case for, this creates new industries. New industries create new jobs, and not just, tens, hundreds, thousands of jobs, but hundreds of thousands to millions of jobs. I think tying those two things together would be a huge step forward in the move to address climate change and do it in a way that is politically viable, that gets us to, the level where even Congress can't ignore it. And, obviously it's been a tough haul on the Medicare for All side to make the case that it is, in fact, the cheapest way to get to universal quality healthcare. There's been a disinformation campaign that's been engaged in by members of the right, but also some members of the center, to say that, oh, the price tag is too big. But when you look at the time horizon, Medicare for All would save us in the net billions of dollars. And, a lot of people have addressed that, more fulsomely than I could. But it's one of those things that hasn't been, rammed home enough just how much money this saves when the system that we currently have is so wasteful. It's a win-win. And so I'd say, obviously that's not my idea, right? This is an idea that many people have tried, but I think, it's time to redouble our efforts, especially, we're hoping that this pandemic is waning, but with what's going on in India, as many people smarter than me have said, it creates a breeding ground for more variants to develop that might be more resistant to the vaccine, and we might land back, God forbid, back right where we started with this pandemic. So combining that, that sort of urgent current need, this pandemic that has terrified the world, with the more systemic, long-lasting problem of access to healthcare in general. I think the case can be made there, and some are making it, but the voices that are making it are quite peripheral, I'd say, to power, in terms of getting this in front of people's faces and using bully pulpits, I believe is the appropriate term here, to get people on board with legislation that could mean the health of millions more people here at home. And to that end, I think another thing that goes to, the lack of pressure that's been applied to those in power. And again, I've made that critique of members that self-identify as being on the left in Congress. We've got to re-engage in the rhetorical battle of stopping letting people get away with saying they want universal health care without presenting a roadmap with a timeline and a goal for how we get there, when, as I just now said, people are dying from treatable conditions due to lack of health insurance. And obviously the pandemic brings that problem into starker relief. And then if I can swing back to the climate change side of things, we can engage in a similar debate by stopping letting people say they trust science without talking about how current plans don't address the models for points of no return, as the science says, for our climate. We've got to be in a position to say, okay, you believe in the science disagrees with the scope of your plan. It's not big enough. And, this is likely to be, if recent history is any indicator, this is likely to be a series of debates that are pushed from the outside inward. And that's unfortunate that we can't count on our representatives to make the case for us. We have to get out there and make the case ourselves. And I guess I'm committing to be part of that fight. um, if it's not clear that I consider myself part of that fight, perhaps I'm recommitting to that fight to get us talking about these plans that brought a number of people into Congress under the auspices of hope and change, and yet here we are, and so this goes to the broader systemic framework that I've tried to build into the fabric of this podcast. Of okay, how do we treat this like a software problem where the problems are knowns and the solutions are tinkerable, and we just have to make the case to the people, to the users of the product called democracy. We have to make the case for why this is what they want, and then show them what the product would look like. Make the case for why the product is the right product for them. And so I talked about this in passing last episode, but one of the things that I'm fighting for with the Decent Federalism Project is, an international system and U.S. foreign policy framework that fights for people, planet, and progress towards a sustainable future for the environment, public health, and democracy. And there's a sort of easy allusion made there from planet to environment, from people to public health, and perhaps less clear, of an analogy from progress to democracy. One of, I guess, maybe the unsaid or less, not as well stated, to critique myself a little bit here, parts of my advocacy is that growing democracy accelerates progress. The more democracy we have, and I believe in representative democracy. I'm not advocating for direct democracy in total. I'm not making the case for everything to be voted on by everyone and going from there. But if we move in a direction where we democratize greater parts of our society, talked about democratizing the economy, the human rights system that we have. Suffice it to say that when you increase democratic spaces, I guess, in our society, whether it's rhetorical spaces or physical spaces or institutions, when you increase democracy in the world, it makes room for more progress. And so that is a case that I will definitely continue to make, and I'll have more to say in future episodes about foreign policy, how this impacts that. But suffice it to say, this is about making changes here at home, but also advocating for real change abroad that is consistent with the values that we are hopefully doing a better job of espousing at home. And so I guess that leads to the last piece, which is, generally, and I've been making this case for the last couple of episodes, this change, this democratization of society is more possible in a decentralized U.S. It's more possible when we distribute the power of our government to constituencies that are more likely to take up that power and use it to make progress. And I hope people will, take a look at decentfedproject.org and my Twitter at decentfedproj, if they haven't already, to get a sense of, what that decentralized U.S. would look like. It's probably outside the scope of what is already looking like a decent-sized episode. So I guess suffice it to say, to kind of wrap it up, these are things worth fighting for. Universal healthcare is worth fighting for. Addressing climate change in a way that reduces inequality is worth fighting for. And I hope I've provided a couple of new ways to kind of look at these problems. Perhaps not my most original episode in the sense that a lot of these ideas are kind of floating out in the ether already. But when it comes to, building off of the last episode on theories of political change, at the end of the day, we've got to start getting more aggressive again, I think. Perhaps that's too strong a word for some, but we have to thrust ourselves into the debate again. And perhaps I hope I've presented a few ways to start doing that. And so I think I'll leave it there for today. As I said, I'm available on Twitter at DecentFedProj. Depending on how you're taking this in, you should know that the podcast is available on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. Next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue. I think we did a decent job of being timely, at least this time around, that deserves a new set of eyes. I don't know what I'm going to get into next. You'll just have to tune in next time to find out. Until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thanks so much for listening.